Have you ever thought about losing everything at once? Imagine that you are living a peaceful life with your family. Everything is fine until suddenly a great sadness takes over your heart and you feel that nothing will be the same again. This happened with Naomi. She lost her husband, her children, and the pain seemed to have no end. She was left alone in the midst of great sadness, not knowing what to do. The story begins in a difficult time, at a time when judges still ruled Israel. The land of Judah, more specifically the city of Bethlehem, known as Casa de Pain, ironically finds itself immersed in a large hunger crisis. The land was dry, the fields were unharvested, and the people suffered. It was as if the ground had closed its mouth and refused to feed those who lived off it. And there, among those who felt this scarcity in their skin, there lived a man called Elimelech, together with his wife Naomi, and their two sons, Little and Quilom, an ordinary family with dreams, plans, and routines like any other. But hunger changes everything. Hunger doesn't wait. It tightens your stomach and your heart. It leads people to make difficult choices. It was then that Elimelech made a courageous, or desperate, depending on your point of view, decision. He decided to leave his homeland and take his family to a place where there was bread, where there was life, the land of Moab. Now, think about this for a moment. Leaving Bethlehem, the city where they were born, where their roots were, their faith, their heritage, and go to Moab, a foreign land with other customs, another people, another God. Moab was, in fact, a place with a tense past in relation to Israel. There was rivalry, differences, prejudices. But when hunger knocks on the door, human beings often take risks on paths they never imagined they would take. And so, Naomi, Elimelech, and their children pack their lives into a few suitcases and head to a distant place, carrying the weight of uncertainty on their shoulders. On the road to Moab, perhaps Naomi looked back, seeing the mountains of Judah dwarf the horizon. Maybe. Your heart already knew that that journey would change everything. What they didn't know is that that simple act of leaving home because of hunger would be the starting point of one of the most beautiful and redemptive stories in the Bible, the story of Ruth. Upon arriving in the land of Moab, Elimelech, Naomi, and their children begin a new stage of life. Far from Bethlehem, far from everything they knew, they try to rebuild their history, as so many do when life demands new beginnings. Moab was not exactly a welcoming place for an Israelite. The culture was different, the traditions strange, the people are suspicious, and above all, faith was different. The God of Israel was not worshipped there, but still, Naomi's family remained. Life needed to go on, and they tried to live. Over time, the sons, Mahlon and Chilion, grew up and married. Each took a Moabite wife for himself, something that, for many Israelites, was unthinkable. One of them married a woman named Orphan, and the other with a young woman named Ruth. And here appears the name that would later shine in the lineage of the Messiah himself. The Bible tells us that they lived there for about 10 years. They were silent years, without many details recorded, but you can imagine the routine becoming established. The house being assembled, local friendships emerging, the women learning the stories of Israel from Naomi, one day after another trying to build a stable life. That family that arrived fleeing hunger now seemed to have settled down. There was marriage, there was work, there was hope. But as so often happens in life, what seemed firm begins to crumble. The next chapter of this story takes us to the Valley of Pain, where hope seems to wither and all that remains is longing. Because suffering, unfortunately, also knocks on the doors of the righteous. Life in Moab seemed to be taking shape. 10 years had passed since Naomi and her family had left Bethlehem. Her sons were married. She had 2 daughters-in-law who were now part of her heart. But suddenly, without warning, tragedy knocked on the door, and it didn't come alone. First, Elimelech dies. Without her husband by her side, Naomi finds herself a widow in a foreign land. And what was already difficult now became even more difficult. She was a woman without protection, without security, at a time when the man was the provider and the basis of the family. But at least he still had his 2 children. But time cruelly would bring more pain. Mahlon and Chilion also die. The Bible is direct, almost dry when reporting this devastating sequence. And both Mahlon and Chilion also died. The woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. Ruth 1:5. Naomi is now alone in a country that is not yours, without a husband, without children, without grandchildren, only with their daughters-in-law, also widows, young, childless, and marked by grief. Think about the weight of this loneliness. Naomi was already an older woman. She had lost everything that gave her identity: her husband, her children, her security, her future. The pain was so deep that she would later say, "The Almighty has afflicted me. I went out full, and the Lord brought me back empty." Ruth and Orpah, the daughters-in-law, could have left, started their lives over with. Other men, other stories. But there they were, with Naomi, 3 widows united by bonds of love and tragedy. A silent portrait of the pain that often takes over life without asking for permission. But it is in the midst of pain that God begins to weave miracles. Because, as we will see in the next chapter, Naomi's emptiness was about to be filled, not with what she expected, but with something much greater than she could have imagined. In the midst of the deepest pain, news reaches Naomi like a ray of light in a cloudy sky. The Lord had visited his people, giving them bread. The famine that once ravaged Bethlehem had passed. The land of promise bloomed again. Hope was reborn. Faced with this, Naomi makes a decision. She will come home. It wasn't an easy choice. After all, she was no longer the same woman who had left. 10 years earlier, she had left Bethlehem hand in hand with her husband and children. Now she came back alone, bitter, and with nothing in her arms, just 2 Moabite daughters-in-law. Even so, Naomi gets up. "Pack your few things." And he leaves with Ruth and Orpah towards his homeland. But on the way, perhaps made aware of the harsh reality that awaited them, Naomi stops. She turns to her daughters-in-law and says something touching. "Go back to your mother's house. Mekiko, the Lord show kindness to you, as you did to me and those who departed. May the Lord grant that each may find rest in another husband's home." She knew the future in Israel would be uncertain, especially for 2 young foreign widows. In Bethlehem, Ruth and Orpah would probably be frowned upon, as they were Moabites, descendants of a people hostile to Israel. And Naomi didn't want to see them suffer. The 3 cry, "Very." There's a lump in your throat. Her daughters-in-law don't want to leave her. They say, "We will go with you to your people." But Naomi insists. She says, "My daughters, come back. Why would you come with me? Could I still have sons to become your husbands?" Naomi speaks with a broken heart, but with realism. She feels bitter and no longer sees hope, and this is where a choice would forever mark history. Orphan, still crying, kisses Naomi and leaves. She returns to her family, to her people, to her faith. Ruth, however, it stays, and when Naomi tries to send her away too, Ruth responds with one of the most powerful and faithful statements ever recorded in Scripture, which we will see in the next chapter. This decision by Ruth would not only change the course of her and Naomi's lives, but it would shape the future of Israel's royal lineage and even the arrival of the Messiah. The scene is heartbreaking. 3 women on the side of the road in tears. The road that led from Moab to Bethlehem now became the stage for a farewell that none of them wanted to face. Orphan, still emotional, holds Naomi's hand one last time. She kisses her mother-in-law with affection and respect, and with teary eyes turns around. She leaves, not because of a lack of love, but because she couldn't break away from everything she knew. She returns to her people, for your gods, for the security of a more predictable future. And so, Orpah disappears from biblical history, leaving only his name and his pain in that farewell. But Ruth remains there, stopped, firm, determined. Naomi insists, tries to persuade her once again. See, your sister-in-law has returned to her people and her gods. You too return like her. But at this moment something happens grand, unexpected and profound. Ruth doesn't just say she's staying. She makes a declaration of loyalty and faith that still resonates today as one of the most striking lines in the Bible. With a firm voice and resolute heart, she declares, "Do not insist that I leave you and move away from you, for wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you land, there I will land. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Wherever you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord punish me if anything other than death separates me from you." Ruth 1, 16, 17. Those words were more than promises. They were a vow, a soul pact. Ruth was renouncing her past, her culture, her gods, her homeland, to embrace Naomi's future. She didn't just choose her mother-in-law, she chose the God of Israel. By faith, Naomi realizes that there was nothing more to say. Ruth had decided. And then the two women continue their journey, now united not only by pain, but by alliance. This moment of farewell reveals much more than separation. It shows the kind of love that is not measured by convenience, but by commitment. A love that reflects God's own character, faithful, constant, sacrificial. And it is with this loyal heart that Ruth enters the history of Israel and the hearts of everyone who knows her journey. The way back to Bethlehem was no longer the same. Now, two women walked side by side in silence, one older, marked by pain and mourning, the other young woman, a foreigner, but with a heart full of courage and faith. Ruth and Naomi. They were walking towards the unknown, but there was something in that moment that sealed a new beginning, a declaration of love and eternal loyalty. Ruth, with those deep and definitive words, she didn't just make an oath to Naomi. She made a pact with God. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. These were not empty words. They were proof that Ruth's heart had been touched by the faith of the people of Israel. She was leaving everything familiar behind, your home, your tongue, your culture, your pagan gods, and even their human security perspectives. It was a total surrender, a step in the dark, but with our eyes turned to the true God. This statement not only moved Naomi, but revealed who Ruth really was, a woman of fiber, of word, of faith, a young woman who saw in Naomi, even in the midst of her bitterness, a reflection of the living God, and he chose to follow this God. The beautiful thing is that at that time, a foreigner was not easily accepted in Israel. There were prejudices, reservations, distinctions, but Ruth didn't care. She loved Naomi, and more than that, she loved the God of Naomi. Even without promises, without guarantees, without knowing what awaited her, she decided to stay. And that is why this speech by Ruth is considered of the most beautiful expressions of love and fidelity throughout Scripture. Because she is firm, unconditional, sacrificial. It's the kind of love God wants us to have for Him and for each other. This decision sealed Ruth's fate. She didn't know yet, but God was leading her to a place of honor, because love like this does not go unnoticed in the eyes of heaven. With a firm heart, Ruth walks alongside Naomi to Bethlehem, and there a new stage of history begins. Bottom of form arriving in Bethlehem was just the first step on a journey full of challenges. Naomi and Ruth, they were back, but the difficulties were still immense. Without husbands and without means of support, the situation was desperate. Society at the time did not have social security systems like today, and widows depended on a very peculiar type of assistance, estate right, which allowed them to collect the remains of the harvest in the fields. It was the beginning of barley harvest, and that brought a little hope. Ruth, being young and strong, he knew it was his responsibility to try to help Naomi. She proposed, "Let me go to the field and gather ears of grain after anyone who is favorable to me." Ruth 2:2. Naomi, who was already marked by suffering, no longer had the strength to argue, but agreed. Ruth then goes out into the city looking for a field where she could harvest the fallen ears. It wasn't an easy job, and it wasn't for everyone. She knew she would have to expose herself to the goodwill of the camp owners. However, God had plans that Ruth could not yet see. She entered the field of Boaz, a rich man, but also a righteous man who not only owned land, but respected God's law to care for those in need. God, in his providence, took Ruth exactly there. The Bible tells us that Boaz noticed Ruth as soon as he saw her. He asked his servants who she was. When I found out it was Ruth, a Moabite who had returned with Naomi, he was impressed by her kindness, by her loyalty. He had already heard how she left her homeland, her family, and her gods to follow Naomi and worship the God of Israel. Boaz then decides to act generously. He orders his servants to let Ruth reap as she pleases, without fear of being reprimanded. And in addition, he asks her to harvest in the richest areas of the field, and even gives instructions for them to leave ears intentionally for her. When Ruth realizes the favor she was receiving, she approaches Boaz and asks, "Why did I find grace in your eyes to treat me with such kindness when I was a foreigner?" Ruth 2:10, Boaz responds movingly, "I was told everything that you did for your mother-in-law after the death of your husband, how you left your father and your mother and the land in which you were born, and came to a people you did not know before. May the Lord reward you for this." Ruth 2:11-12. These words of Boaz not only acknowledge Ruth's sacrifice, but also God's action through human kindness. He sees in Ruth the hand of the Lord, and at the same time, the hand of Boaz extended as an instrument of this providence. At the end of the day, Ruth returns home, carrying a large amount of barley. Naomi, upon seeing her, is impressed by Boaz's generosity and through his wisdom realizes that he could be the redeemer of the family. The term redeemer has great meaning in Israelite culture. The closest relative who had the responsibility of protecting the family, rescuing lost property, and in some cases, marrying a widow to secure the lineage. God, therefore, was beginning to work in ways that Ruth and Naomi could not even imagine. After harvest day, when Ruth returned home with the bountiful barley harvest, Naomi realized that there was something very special happening. The fact that Boaz, having treated Ruth so generously, was not simple. He was a close relative, one redeemer potential for the family. This did not go unnoticed by Naomi, who was always thinking about Ruth's future. Then, with a wisdom that only experience can bring, Naomi begins to develop a plan. She knew this was her opportunity to guarantee her daughter-in-law's safety and future, and of course, the fulfillment of God's promises. Naomi approaches Ruth and says, "My daughter, don't I have the right to look for a home for you, where you will be happy? And is not Boaz, with whose maids you were, one of our relatives?" Ruth 3.1. She then instructs Ruth to prepare for an event that would take place in Barley Night, a moment of celebration in the countryside. Boaz would be there, harvesting and separating the grains. Naomi tells Ruth to bathe, put on her best clothes and go to Boaz, but with a very clear intention, ask him to fulfill his role as redeemer. Naomi's strategy was bold and full of symbolism. She knew that as she approached Boaz, Ruth was implying that she wanted him to be the family's redeemer, following the tradition of runaway, in which the closest relative married the widow to preserve the family lineage and inheritance. On the night of the event, Ruth, with courage and her mind focused on her family's future, follows Naomi's instructions. She goes to the field where Boaz was, approaches him as he sleeps, and discover your feet, a symbolic gesture that signified ask for protection and a commitment to redemption. When Boaz wakes up, he finds Ruth at his side and, surprised, she asks him with words that overflow humility and courage, "You are my closest relative. Spread your mantle over your servant, for you are the Redeemer." Ruth 3.9. This speech, simple but powerful, is a request for marriage, protection, continuity of lineage, and most importantly, a request for Boaz to assume the role of redeemer. According to Israelite tradition, Boaz, touched by Ruth's gesture, responds with great generosity and kindness. He recognizes her dignity, the sacrifice she made for Naomi, and the honor she brought him by making such a request. Boaz promises to fulfill his part, but there is a condition. There is another closer relative, one who has the right to redeem, before him. However, he assures Ruth that if this relative does not want to fulfill the role of redeemer, Boaz will be responsible. Ruth returns to Naomi with good news. The plan had worked. Boaz, a fair and generous man, was willing to rescue the family, but there was still a step to be taken for everything to be accomplished. With the dawn, Ruth returns to Naomi, bringing the good news that Boaz had accepted the request and was willing to act in favor of his family. But before the wedding could be celebrated, there was still one crucial step to be taken. Boaz, as the righteous man that he was, knew that there was another, closer relative who had the right to redeem the property and marry Ruth. This was part of the law of runway, where the closest relative had the responsibility of marrying the widow and ensuring the continuity of the family and inheritance. Then Boaz immediately addresses the city gate, where elders met to resolve legal issues. There, he would wait for the other relative, the nearest redeemer, to discuss the situation and make a decision. When the next of kin arrives, Boaz begins to lay out the situation intelligently and carefully. He mentions that the estate of Elimelech, Naomi's late husband, is for sale and offers this relative the right to buy it if he wishes. The other relative, thinking about the advantage of acquiring the land, immediately agrees. But Boaz then asks the crucial question. On the day you acquire Naomi's property, you will also have to take Ruth the Moabite as your wife, so that the deceased's inheritance will be preserved. Ruth 4:5. The relative's response is immediate. I cannot fulfill the ransom lest I harm my own inheritance. Ruth 4:6. Here the relative refuses, as he already had a family of his own, and would prefer not to take on a responsibility that could affect his inheritance. The decision not to redeem Elimelech's property and lineage opens the way for Boaz. Now Boaz takes the floor and before the elders and the people who were gathered declares that he and he alone will take it upon himself to redeem the property and marry Ruth so that the lineage of Elimelech is preserved. Boaz then publicly announces, "You are witnesses that today I bought from Naomi everything that belongs to Elimelech, Chilion, and Mahlon, and that I also took Ruth the Moabite, widow of Mahlon, as my wife, to restore the name of the deceased over his inheritance." Ruth 4:9-10. With these words, the redemptive agreement is signed. Boaz takes responsibility for redeeming Naomi's property and marrying Ruth. This act not only guarantees the continuity of the lineage, but also fulfills the divine plan of restoration. For Naomi and Ruth, the elders and people of Bethlehem, upon seeing Boaz's action, recognize the justice of his decision and bless the couple. They proclaim a prophetic blessing on the future of the lineage of Boaz and Ruth, saying, "May the Lord make the woman who enters your house like Rachel and Leah, who built the house of Israel, and may you be illustrious in Ephratah and renowned in Bethlehem." Ruth 4:11-12. With this blessing, Boaz and Ruth become the center of a new beginning for Israel. And the wonderful thing is that even though this was an act of justice and compliance with laws, it would become the beginning of a great story. The lineage that was about to form would be the King David's lineage, and eventually the lineage of the Messiah, Jesus Christ. After the formalized agreement between Boaz and the nearest Redeemer, the fate of Ruth and Naomi is sealed in a wonderful and meaningful way. Boaz and Ruth get married, and this marriage is not just a union of two hearts, but an act of redemption and restoration. The marriage of Ruth and Boaz is not described in much detail in the Bible, but what we do know is that it was held with great joy and blessings. Boaz takes Ruth as his wife, and as promised, she becomes pregnant shortly after the wedding. This pregnancy, although natural, marks the fulfillment of the divine plan. God, in his infinite wisdom and kindness, was bringing the restoration not only for Naomi's life, but also for the entire family of Israel. What seemed to be a tragic and bitter end, the death of Elimelech, his children, and the loss of his inheritance, now turned into a new opportunity for life, a future and hope. When Naomi found out about Ruth's pregnancy, she experienced great grief, joy, and gratitude. The people of Bethlehem, seeing the transformation of Naomi's life, are also filled with hope. What once seemed desolate was now being filled with the promise of new days. Ruth gives birth to a son, and this baby is called at lunch. This name is significant because it represents the restoration of the Elimelech family lineage and also marks the beginning of a generation blessed by God. Naomi, in her wisdom and in her love for Ruth, welcomes her son into her arms as if he were her own grandson. She, who was bitter and felt empty, now has a new reason to smile and be grateful. The Naomi's joy is visible when she says, "Blessed be the Lord, who has not failed to give you a rescuer today." Ruth 4:14. The people around also recognize God's providence. They know that at lunch it will be a fundamental part of Israel's history. The most extraordinary thing is that Obed would become King David's grandfather, one of Israel's greatest and most beloved kings, and through David the Messiah, Jesus Christ, fulfilling God's promise to redeem and bless all humanity. That's the beauty of the story of Ruth and Naomi. A life marked by pain and loss, God brought restoration, hope, and a new beginning. He used a young Moabite woman, a woman of faith, to be part of the Messiah's lineage. The marriage of Ruth and Boaz was not just the end of a journey. It was the beginning of a new generation, a generation that would testify to God's goodness and faithfulness throughout the centuries. And God, through this union, showed how he can transform tragedies into blessings, how he can act in the most difficult situations and bring light where there was darkness before. After the birth of At Lunch, the story of Ruth and Boaz gains importance that goes far beyond their own generation. What seemed to be a simple story of a Moabite woman who found a redeemer in Israel became the foundation of something bigger and more eternal. At lunch, the son of Ruth and Boaz grows up and becomes the father of Jesse, and Jesse, in turn, is the father of David, the future king of Israel. The legacy of Ruth and Boaz is therefore the foundation of the royal lineage of Israel, culminating in the person of David, the great king, and later at the birth of Jesus Christ, the promised Messiah. It is interesting to realize that Ruth, a Moabite woman, that is, a foreigner, becomes the mother of one of the Messiah's ancestors, showing in a profound way how God is no respecter of persons. He uses those who are faithful, regardless of their origin or nationality, to fulfill his sovereign plans. The simple act of Ruth's faith and obedience by following Naomi and worshipping the God of Israel brought a transformation not only for your own life, but for the entire history of humanity. David's lineage, which begins with the marriage of Ruth and Boaz, is mentioned several times in the Bible, including in Gospel of Matthew, where the genealogy of Jesus is reported. In the line of David surged Jesus Christ, the Redeemer who comes to save humanity. The Gospel of Matthew opens with the words, "Book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, son of David, son of Abraham." Matthew 1:1. This simple but deep story of love, faith, and redemption transforms a salvation history for all people. The lineage of Ruth and Boaz symbolizes the God's faithfulness and his ability to use anyone that you surrender to him to fulfill his salvation plans. The legacy of Ruth and Boaz, then, is not just in their direct descent, but also in message that your story conveys to all of us. She teaches us that even in times of pain and despair, God is acting, preparing the way for a future of hope, redemption, and love. By welcoming the foreigner Ruth and making her part of his plan, God shows the world the greatness of his mercy, where no one is forgotten and everyone has the opportunity to be part of his story. The legacy of Boaz as a just and honorable man cannot be forgotten either. Your generosity and commitment to God's law define the character of God as Redeemer. Boaz not only redeemed the property, but he became a symbol of justice, kindness, and faith in action, being a reflection of the God's faithfulness. The story of Ruth and Boaz teaches us, in a practical and powerful way, that God always has a plan, even when we don't understand the paths he is taking. He uses the most difficult situations, the most unlikely people, to accomplish his sovereign will. What started out as pain and loss turned into a legacy of hope that spans generations and generations. The story of Ruth and Naomi is, above all, a story of divine love, not an ephemeral or passing love, but a deep, faithful, and transformative love. When we look at the trajectory of these two women, we see how God supported and guided them in moments of pain, hopelessness, and loneliness, revealing his providence and loyalty. Naomi, a woman who lost her husband and her children, and who saw her life as bitter, found comfort in God's unconditional love. She did not know in that moment of anguish that God was preparing a future of blessings to her through the loyalty of her daughter-in-law, Ruth. When Naomi decides to return to Bethlehem, she has no idea that her life will become so deeply intertwined with the divine plan. Already Ruth, who had no blood ties to Naomi, but who chose to care for her in her old age and continue to live under the protection of the God of Israel, shows a clear example of sacrificial love. Ruth chose to give herself to Naomi's faith, embracing a new life, leaving behind her homeland, her gods, and everything she knew. This act of loyalty and faith not only rescued his own life, but also became part of a plan divine of redemption. For Israel and for all humanity, God, in his providence, brought Boaz, a just and honorable man, to be the redeemer Naomi's family. Boaz, upon being touched by Ruth's kindness, becomes an instrument of God, fulfilling the laws of redemption which he himself had established to care for orphans, widows, and the needy. When Boaz redeems Naomi's inheritance and marries Ruth, what we see is not just a wedding, but the fulfillment of God's promise to care for his people. God's love is alive and active, not just in words, but in concrete actions that transform lives. The story of Ruth and Naomi also reveals a profound aspect of God's love. He doesn't discriminate against anyone. Ruth, a Moabite woman, a foreigner, is welcomed by God and his people, demonstrating that God's love goes beyond cultural, ethnic, or social borders. He is universal, reaching everyone who gives themselves to him in faith and trust. This story also teaches us that, even in the midst of suffering and difficulties, God never abandons us. When Naomi lost everything and thought God had forgotten her, God was preparing a blessing for her through Ruth and the action of Boaz. God's love is constant, and he has a perfect plan into our lives, even if we cannot understand it at the moment. The God's love in Ruth and Naomi. It is also revealed in the fact that he turns what seemed to be an end, the death of Elimelech, Naomi's husband, and her sons, into an end, new beginning. Through Ruth's faithfulness and love, God not only restored Naomi's inheritance, but brought hope and a future for Israel. The baby, at lunch, born of this love and this union, will be the grandfather of David, the great king, and from his lineage will come Jesus Christ, the Savior of all. This story is therefore a beautiful illustration of God's love by his creation, a love that is tireless, patient, and redemptive, always on the move, working on our lives even when we don't realize it. He uses our choices, our actions, and even our suffering to fulfill his eternal purposes. The story of Ruth and Naomi is a testimony that even in the darkest moments, the God's love never fails. He is always working for the good of those who love and follow him. The story of these two women reminds us that divine love can transform our most difficult circumstances into moments of great hope and renewal. The story of Ruth and Naomi is ultimately a powerful testimony to the God's faithfulness, not just towards these two women, but towards all generations who follow his path. The way God guided the steps of Ruth, Naomi, and Boaz throughout this narrative shows that although we may face difficult and painful times, God always has a bigger plan, and he remains faithful to his promises throughout the generations. From the beginning, we see God working in circumstances, even when it seemed like the future of Naomi and her family was lost. The loss of Elimelech and their children could have been seen as the end of a story, but instead it was the start of something great, which lasted for generations until culminating in the birth of King David and finally at the birth of Jesus, Christ the Savior. God throughout history never fails to keep his promises. He uses the suffering of Naomi to bring to light the love and faithfulness of Ruth, which become the key to the restoration of Elimelech's lineage. This restoration is more than a simple inheritance of property. She is a metaphor for how God restores his creation, bringing back what was lost and offering life where there was death, hope where there was despair. In Ruth 4:22, genealogy presents us with a line of descent that, over the generations, leads to Jesus Christ, the Son of God. God's faithfulness is seen in the continuity of this lineage. The same faithfulness that he demonstrated with Naomi, Ruth, and Boaz. It is what he maintains with all those who seek him. He don't give up on us, even when our lives seem out of control or when the suffering seems endless. The story of Ruth and Naomi also reveals how God uses human actions to fulfill his divine purposes. Ruth chose to follow God and help her mother-in-law. Boaz chose to do what was fair and right, and Naomi, although bitter, trusted God's plan for her life. These human choices, although they seem small, were instruments used by God to bring a future of blessings to the people of Israel. When we look at the following generations, we see that God's faithfulness never failed. A lineage that began with Ruth and Boaz continued with at lunch Jesse and David, and from David came Jesus Christ, fulfilling God's greatest promise, the coming of the Savior. Through Jesus, salvation has come to all peoples, and God's faithfulness became eternal and universal. The story of Ruth and Naomi is a reminder to all of us that regardless of the circumstances we find ourselves in, God is faithful and his love never fails. He keeps his promises throughout all generations, and as we saw in the lives of Ruth and Naomi, he can use even the most difficult situations to bring a great blessing. God does not forget nobody. He sees every detail, listens to the prayers, and it is always working behind the scenes. Even when we don't see it, he is acting on our behalf. The story of Ruth and Naomi is a story of fidelity, hope, and trust in God, and teaches us that no matter how challenging our journeys may be, God is with us, and he always will fulfill what he promised. If you liked our content, Stories from the Bible, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and give a like so that the next videos reach you. Thank you for watching this far.